The unseen divide. Bradford Industries was the kind of company that prided itself on tradition. A sprawling complex of glass and steel in the heart of the city, it was the kind of place where corporate power was held by a select few, and success was defined by staying the course. Its founder, Jonathan Bradford, had built it from the ground up. And now, as its CEO, he felt a deep sense of ownership over its identity. The morning sun cast long shadows across the modern, sleek offices as employees trickled in for the day. The atmosphere seemed bustling, as if the very walls of Bradford Industries thrummed with ambition. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and the hum of productivity filled the air. From the outside, it was the epitome of success, a business powerhouse of tradition and unyielding resolve. But beneath this facade, something was quietly festering, an undercurrent of subtle racism that had been ingrained in the company culture for far too long. In one of the high-rise conference rooms, Maria Rodriguez, the company's bright and ambitious marketing manager, was preparing for a crucial presentation. She had been working day and night, refining her ideas for a campaign aimed at expanding Bradford's market share by targeting a more diverse consumer base. It was a bold strategy, one that included the promotion of products tailored to the needs of minority communities. She believed this could revolutionize the company's approach and open doors to untapped potential. But Maria knew she was facing an uphill battle. She glanced at the faces seated around the large, polished conference table, all white, all middle-aged or older, and all with a similar look of detachment, as if they had heard it all before and had little interest in what she was about to present. She had been in meetings like this before, where her ideas were met with polite indifference at best or outright disregard at worst. Maria began her presentation, her voice steady and confident as she navigated through her slides. In conclusion, she said, her eyes scanning the room, this strategy could help us tap into a whole new demographic, one that we've largely ignored in the past. Not only will this increase our market share by 15%, but it will also position Bradford Industries as a forward-thinking, inclusive company. A moment of silence hung in the air, like a thick fog, before the first words came from Brad Thompson, a senior executive known for his old-school approach to business. "Thanks, Maria," he said, his voice polite but dismissive. "That was interesting. Now, John, didn't you have some thoughts on our traditional markets?" Maria's heart sank. She had been expecting this. She watched as John, a colleague known for his conservative views on marketing, launched into a long-winded speech about their typical customer base, middle-aged, middle-class white families. It was the same presentation he had given time and again, the same market they had targeted for years. But the room was wrapped with attention, their eyes glued to John as if his words were gospel. Maria's face tightened, and she forced herself to keep a smile in place. She had worked hard to get to this point in her career, and it was clear that her path forward was going to require a lot more than just good ideas. It was going to take a battle to change the company's culture, one battle at a time. As the meeting ended, Maria packed up her materials with a sense of quiet frustration. She knew her ideas had been sidelined, once again, and that nothing would change in the near future. But she was determined. She knew she had to keep pushing, keep challenging the status quo. The world was changing, and it was only a matter of time before Bradford Industries had to catch up. Meanwhile, a few floors down in the Human Resources Department, Marcus Turner, a young and talented employee, was sitting across from Linda, the HR manager, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just finished an interview for a management position, a role he knew he was more than qualified for. He had consistently exceeded expectations, his performance reviews glowing, and his initiative had been praised by his team. Yet now he found himself on the receiving end of a disappointing answer. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Linda said, her tone businesslike but cold. "We decided to go with someone else for the position. We felt they were a better fit for the company culture." Marcus felt a sting of disappointment, but he masked it well. He had heard the same line too many times before. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice betraying none of the frustration he felt. "Is there any feedback you can give me for future opportunities?" Linda gave a tight smile. "Just keep doing what you're doing, Marcus. Your time will come." As he left her office, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his time would never come. Not in a company like Bradford Industries. He glanced at the photo on the wall of the management team. A sea of white faces smiling down at him. There were no people of color in the executive suite, and in all his years at Bradford, he had never seen anyone like himself promoted to a position of real authority. It was a silent message that spoke volumes. Marcus couldn't help but wonder how many others were passed over for promotion, how many talented employees had been marginalized simply because they didn't fit the mold of what Bradford considered leadership material. He knew it wasn't just about qualifications. It was about something deeper, something that had been entrenched in the company's culture for decades. Meanwhile, in his sprawling office at the top of Bradford Industries, Jonathan Bradford was pacing back and forth, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He was a man who had built a billion-dollar empire with his own two hands. He had worked tirelessly, made countless sacrifices, and weathered every storm. Bradford Industries was his legacy, his creation. But lately, he had been feeling a sense of unease. Sarah, his assistant, sat in front of him, clutching a folder. "Sir," she said, hesitantly, "I've brought the proposal for the diversity initiatives you requested." Bradford scoffed, his face twisting into a look of disdain. "What next, Sarah? Mandatory yoga sessions and free kale smoothies." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I understand your concerns, but many companies are seeing the benefits of embracing diversity. It's linked to increased innovation and profitability." Bradford's eyes narrowed as he glared at her. "That's all well and good for tech startups and hipster coffee shops, but this is Bradford Industries. We've done things our way for decades, and we've done just fine. These inclusivity programs are just distractions. What we need to focus on is making money and keeping our shareholders happy. That's what has always worked." Sarah nodded silently, knowing better than to argue further. She understood that Bradford was not the type of man to embrace change easily. But as she left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world was changing around him, and he was failing to keep up. As the day went on, the undercurrents of subtle racism and resistance to change continued to ripple through Bradford Industries. At the company cafeteria, a group of executives gathered for lunch, their voices low and animated. Among them was Brad Thompson, fresh from the marketing meeting. "Did you see Maria's presentation?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "I mean, I'm sure the urban market is great and all, but that's not who we are." Another executive, Tom, nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Bradford built this company on solid traditional values. We can't start changing things just to appease every minority group out there." A younger executive, Mike, looked uncomfortable. "I don't know, guys. Maybe we should at least consider some of these new ideas. The world is changing, after all." The group fell silent, staring at Mike in a mixture of surprise and disapproval. Brad leaned in, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "Listen, Mike, you're new here. Let me give you some advice. Bradford knows what he's doing. Our investors trust his judgment. If you want to get ahead in this company, you'd do well to fall in line." Mike nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken message. It wasn't about innovation or fresh ideas. It was about loyalty to a system that, for all its faults, had worked, at least for the people in charge. As the day wore on, the subtle instances of racism and resistance to change continued to play out across the company. Aisha, a talented designer, had her innovative product concepts repeatedly passed over in favor of more traditional designs. Raj, a young engineer, found himself consistently assigned to maintenance tasks, while his white colleagues were given the exciting new projects. Each instance, though small, painted a clear picture of a company that was resistant to change and deeply entrenched in its outdated biases. For the employees of Bradford Industries, it was a daily battle, one that was fought not just with words or ideas, but with the very essence of who they were. It was a battle for recognition, for opportunity, and most importantly, for equality. And as the company's culture remained rooted in its old ways, the future looked uncertain for those who dared to challenge the status quo. The struggle for change. Aaron Johnson leaned back in the worn-out leather chair in his office, his eyes scanning the city skyline outside. It was late afternoon, and the streets of the city below were bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. He had always found solace in the view, even when the city seemed to pulse with unspoken tensions that he was very familiar with. As a successful investor and entrepreneur, Aaron had built his wealth through shrewd decisions and a deep understanding of market trends. But wealth alone had never been his true driving force. Aaron's passion lay in creating opportunities for people who had been historically marginalized, who had been pushed aside or excluded from the financial world because of their race, gender, or background. It was a cause that Aaron had grown up with. His family had always been committed to social justice, with his parents working tirelessly in their community to support equality and fight against systemic injustice. Aaron's phone buzzed on his desk, and he glanced at the screen. It was a text from his wife, Monique. She was asking him if he was free for dinner. He smiled, replying that he would be home soon. They had an evening planned with their kids, a rare opportunity to reconnect amidst their busy lives. But as he put his phone down, his thoughts drifted back to Bradford Industries. He had invested heavily in the company, believing that its potential to evolve and embrace diversity could set it apart in the industry. When he had first made the decision to put his money into Bradford, he had been convinced that Jonathan Bradford, despite his old-school views, would eventually come around. After all, Aaron had seen firsthand how companies that adapted to the changing landscape reaped the benefits, both in profitability and reputation. But now, after months of frustration, Aaron had his doubts. Bradford Industries wasn't evolving. It was digging its heels in deeper, and the resistance to change was more entrenched than he had imagined. It wasn't just a matter of profit margins or strategic shifts. It was about something deeper, something more fundamental. The values of the company. Despite all its achievements, Bradford Industries was failing to recognize the diverse world it was operating in. In fact, the unspoken bias at every level of the company, from the boardroom to the break room, was becoming more glaring. Aaron couldn't help but think about Maria Rodriguez, the marketing manager whose presentation had been all but ignored at the last meeting. Her ideas had been creative, forward-thinking, and precisely the type of innovation the company needed, but instead, the executives had pushed her aside in favor of the same stale, outdated strategies that had been in place for decades. It was a pattern Aaron had seen too many times before. Talented, driven individuals of color being overlooked, their contributions diminished simply because they didn't fit into the mold of what the leadership thought was acceptable. Maria wasn't the only one. He knew of Marcus Turner, the young employee in HR, who had been passed over for a management position despite his clear qualifications, and Aisha, the product designer whose ideas had been ignored in favor of more conventional designs. Bradford Industries had an innovation problem, but not just in the sense of failing to stay current with market trends. It had a deeper issue. It was missing out on the potential of its people, its most valuable asset, because it refused to recognize that true success came from embracing diversity in all its forms. Aaron sighed and picked up his phone again, this time dialing Monique. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, babe. Everything okay?" "Yeah," Aaron replied, though his voice betrayed his concerns, just thinking about Bradford Industries. Monique didn't hesitate. "Still frustrated, huh?" "More than ever. It's like hitting a wall over and over again. I thought they'd get it by now, but the culture there is still so resistant to change. It's infuriating." Monique, a seasoned corporate strategist herself, knew all too well the battles Aaron was fighting. She had faced similar challenges in her own career, and they often discussed how difficult it was for people of color to rise in the corporate world when there were invisible barriers in place. Barriers that had little to do with ability and everything to do with prejudice. "You're doing the right thing by staying involved," she said, her voice steady. "But maybe it's time to think about how you can push harder. Sometimes, a little shock to the system is what it takes to wake people up." Aaron thought for a moment. "Yeah, you might be right. I've been playing it safe, trying to be patient, hoping they'll see the value of the diversity initiatives on their own. But maybe it's time I made my presence known in a bigger way. If they don't understand the importance of this, maybe they need to feel the consequences of ignoring it." There was a pause on the line as Monique let his words sink in. Then she spoke again, this time with a touch of humor in her voice. "I don't think Jonathan Bradford is ready for you to come in guns blazing, but I know you'll figure it out. Just don't forget, you've got the power to change the game. You've already been doing it. You just need to push harder." Aaron smiled. He had always known that change in a company like Bradford Industries wouldn't be easy, but he was beginning to understand that maybe it wasn't about waiting for them to come around. Maybe it was about shaking up the very foundation they stood on, forcing them to confront their outdated ideas. He couldn't let this opportunity slip through his fingers, not when he knew that by leading Bradford to embrace diversity, he could not only make the company more successful, but also more just. That evening, as he sat down for dinner with Monique and their children, Aaron found himself consumed by the idea. They spoke about their day. The kids filled the room with laughter, and for a moment, the pressures of the corporate world seemed to fade away. But even as he smiled and listened to his kids talk about their plans for the weekend, Aaron's mind was already working on his next move. He knew he had to do something more, something that would make the leaders at Bradford Industries sit up and take notice. The next morning, Aaron found himself sitting at his desk, staring at a draft of a letter he had written. It was a bold move, one that would undoubtedly shake up the leadership at Bradford Industries, but he was tired of playing the long game. His wealth and influence gave him the power to bring about real change, but it also meant that the people in power would take him seriously, or at least, they would have to. He pressed send, dispatching the letter to Jonathan Bradford and the board members of the company. Later that afternoon, Jonathan Bradford sat in his office, flipping through the documents on his desk when he received the email. The subject line read, "A wake-up call for Bradford Industries." His eyes narrowed as he clicked open the message, and he felt his frustration grow as he read. "Dear Jonathan, I am writing to you as both an investor and a concerned member of the business community. For months now, I have watched as Bradford Industries continues to lag behind in embracing the changing dynamics of the modern market. The resistance to diversity and inclusion within your company is not just an oversight, it's a liability. It's holding Bradford back from realizing its true potential. I have invested in Bradford Industries because I believe in its future. But that future is at risk if the company continues to operate as if it exists in a different era. Your leadership team is out of touch with the world, and it is time to address that. Change is not just inevitable. It is necessary for survival in today's competitive environment. I strongly urge you to reconsider the company's stance on diversity. Failure to do so may have lasting repercussions, both financially and reputationally. I hope we can meet soon to discuss how we can move forward, but know this, I expect change, and I expect it soon. Sincerely, Aaron Johnson." Jonathan Bradford stared at the email for several long moments, his face flushing with anger. How dare Aaron question his leadership? Who did this man think he was, making demands of him? A man who had built this empire with his bare hands. But as his initial rage subsided, a nagging thought crept into Jonathan's mind. Aaron Johnson was one of Bradford Industries' largest investors, and his influence could be significant. Perhaps it was time for a reckoning. The game was about to change, but Jonathan Bradford wasn't going to go down without a fight. A clash of visions. The week that followed Aaron's bold letter to Jonathan Bradford was a time of high tension in the corporate offices of Bradford Industries. News of the letter spread quickly among the upper echelons of the company. sending ripples of unease through the ranks of executives. Jonathan Bradford, normally a man of unwavering confidence, found himself grappling with a growing sense of uncertainty. The email was not just a personal challenge, it was a public indictment of the very values he had built his empire upon. Bradford Industries had long been defined by its unyielding commitment to tradition, and Jonathan had always prided himself on being a steadfast guardian of that legacy. For decades, the company had prospered by sticking to its tried-and-true business model. The notion of embracing diversity, of changing the way things had always been done, seemed like an unnecessary disruption. Yet now, the voices of dissent were becoming louder, not just from outside the company, but from within its walls. In the boardroom, Jonathan called an emergency meeting. The executives filed in, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. Among them was Brad Thompson, the senior marketing executive whose dismissal of Maria's ideas had earned him a reputation as a traditionalist. He was seated beside Tom, another long-serving executive, both men looking grim as they prepared for what was coming. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, his face tight with frustration. "I've just received a letter from Aaron Johnson," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You all know him, our largest investor. He's questioning our entire approach to business. He says we're out of touch and demands we make changes to how we handle diversity and inclusion. What do you all think?" There was a collective silence. The tension was palpable, the kind of stillness that often preceded a storm. Brad Thompson was the first to speak. "Look, Jonathan, we've always known Aaron has strong opinions, but this is a step too far. We've built Bradford Industries on solid traditional values. If we start caving to pressure like this, what's next? Are we going to start catering to every new trend?" Tom nodded in agreement, his voice low but firm. "Aaron's got the money. Sure, but we've been doing things the right way for years. It's worked for us. We've maintained our market share, and we've stayed true to what this company stands for." Jonathan crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "That's exactly what I told Sarah when she brought me the diversity initiative. It's just a distraction, something that might work for tech companies or those new age businesses, but not for us. And now Aaron's trying to tell me what we should do. He's making it personal." At the far end of the table, Mike, the younger executive who had spoken up during the last meeting, shifted uncomfortably. He had listened carefully to the others, but remained quiet until now. "Jonathan, I know this isn't what we're used to, but the world is changing. There's a reason companies are moving toward diversity. It's not just a trend. It's about staying relevant. And Aaron's letter, it's not just about him. It's about the future of this company. If we don't adapt, we'll get left behind." There was an audible tension as the room seemed to brace for Jonathan's reaction. He fixed his gaze on Mike, his voice sharper now. "And who are we supposed to cater to, Mike? What's this future you're talking about?" "Bradford Industries is doing just fine." "Doing fine," Mike echoed, his voice steady. "But we could be doing better. We could be ahead of the curve. I've seen firsthand how companies that embrace diversity outperform those that don't. It's not just about profit, it's about innovation, creativity. We're missing out on so many perspectives." "Enough," Jonathan snapped, his frustration bubbling over. "We've had this conversation, and I'm not going to let some investor push me into changing everything just because the world is different. We built this company from the ground up, and we're going to keep doing it our way." There was a brief pause before the door to the conference room opened, and Maria Rodriguez stepped inside. Her presence, though unexpected, was not entirely surprising. For months, she had been pushing to get her ideas heard, and despite the resistance she faced, she wasn't one to back down. Her eyes were focused, determined. She had a point to make. "I couldn't help but overhear," Maria said, her voice calm but unwavering. "With all due respect, Mr. Bradford, you're missing something crucial." Jonathan looked up, his expression hardening. "Maria, we've already heard your ideas." "And you've dismissed them," she replied, undeterred. But the truth is, you're making a mistake. It's not just about the trends. It's about the people, about the millions of customers and employees you're alienating by sticking to the status quo. You think you know what's best, but you're not listening to the voices that matter. The silence in the room was thick as Maria's words sank in. Jonathan's face flushed with indignation, but there was something else behind his anger, something he couldn't quite shake. The world was changing, and he knew it. He had built his empire on the belief that he was in control of everything. But now he was starting to feel the cracks in his carefully constructed world. "I don't need a lecture on what's best for Bradford Industries," Jonathan muttered, his tone colder now. "What I need is for you to focus on doing your job. As for Aaron Johnson, he'll learn that we don't bow to outside pressure." Maria held his gaze. "Maybe you don't bow to pressure, but you should listen to it. And you should start by looking at the people in this company who are being passed over, people who could take us to the next level, if only given the opportunity. That's what Aaron is trying to tell you. We're all fighting the same fight. It's not just about diversity in hiring or marketing. It's about creating a culture where everyone can thrive." The tension in the room was palpable, but Jonathan's expression softened ever so slightly. He didn't say anything more, but the silent understanding was there. This conversation wasn't over. It had just begun. Outside the boardroom, Aaron Johnson was preparing for his next move. His letter had been sent, and now the ball was in Jonathan Bradford's court. But Aaron wasn't the kind of person to sit back and wait. He was used to taking action. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls and meetings as Aaron spoke with other investors and influential people in the business community. His aim was to rally support, not just for the sake of Bradford Industries, but for the larger cause of diversity in business. The issue wasn't just about one company. It was about creating a shift in the entire industry. One afternoon, as he sat in a cafe in the city, Aaron was joined by Monique, who had been listening closely to his concerns. "You've got people on your side, Aaron," she said, sitting down across from him. "The question is, how far are you willing to push this? Are you going to play the long game, or are you going to force their hand?" Aaron stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his mind already racing. "I don't think waiting is going to do it. I've been patient long enough. If Jonathan won't listen, then I'll have to make him understand. This isn't just about a business opportunity. This is about justice. If they want to continue operating the way they have, fine. But they won't do it with my money behind them." Monique nodded. "You've always been a man of conviction, Aaron. If Bradford doesn't get the message now, they'll be left behind. And when that happens, you'll be leading the charge." Aaron smiled, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him. He knew that what he was about to do would change the course of Bradford Industries, but more importantly, it would set a precedent for businesses everywhere. Change wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. And he was determined to be the catalyst for it. Back at Bradford Industries, Jonathan Bradford sat in his office, staring out at the city below. He had never felt more alone in his career. The weight of his decisions, the pressure from his investors, and the challenges within his own company were mounting. But more than that, he felt the world shifting beneath him, a world that was moving forward while he remained stuck in the past. He picked up the phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. For the first time in years, he was unsure whether his legacy would stand the test of time, or whether he would become an artifact of a bygone era. It was a realization that gnawed at him, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't have the answer. Breaking point. The days following Aaron's letter were some of the most tense in the history of Bradford Industries. While Jonathan Bradford held firm to his convictions, the pressure from his board members and the growing unrest within the company was palpable. His once unwavering confidence was now fraying at the edges. It wasn't just the investors who were starting to question his leadership. It was the employees, too. The walls of Bradford Industries, once insulated by decades of tradition, were beginning to crack. Maria Rodriguez, the marketing manager who had once felt sidelined, found herself at the center of a quiet rebellion. After Erin's letter had been circulated, she had been approached by colleagues from various departments, employees who had long felt invisible or overlooked. It was a whisper of a movement, but one that was steadily growing. There was a sense that, with the right push, things could change. Maria had spent years building her career at Bradford Industries, but now she felt like an outsider in her own company. The recent meetings had left her disheartened. Her ideas, so fresh and vital, were continually dismissed by the older executives who maintained their stance that Bradford Industries was better off sticking to what they knew. Her latest campaign idea, targeting urban markets with products tailored to diverse consumers, had been met with condescending remarks and eye rolls. Yet now that Aaron Johnson had put his foot down, some of the same people who had once dismissed her were suddenly pretending that they had always been supportive of change. Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of bitterness rise within her. She had always known that her ideas were innovative, that they could bring the company into a new era. But seeing the way the executives had brushed her aside, not once but repeatedly, was a painful reminder of how deeply ingrained the biases were at Bradford. Now, with Aaron's email in the mix, those same executives were feigning interest in diversity and inclusion, as if it was a new concept that had never crossed their minds before. "Maria, can we talk?" Brad Thompson, the senior executive who had led the dismissal of her ideas just weeks earlier, approached her desk with a forced smile. His tone was overly polite, but his eyes betrayed his unease. He knew the atmosphere was shifting, and he needed to align himself with the right side. Maria looked up from her computer, her face expressionless. "Sure, Brad. What's on your mind?" Brad leaned in, speaking in a lowered voice. "I wanted to apologize for how things went down in that last meeting. I've been thinking a lot about your ideas, and, well, the company could benefit from something fresh. I mean, you were right about the untapped potential in urban markets." Maria's gaze hardened. She knew what he was trying to do. He was covering his tracks, trying to appear progressive now that the winds had changed. She had been around enough to know when someone was trying to protect themselves. "Brad," she said calmly, "I appreciate your change of heart, but the truth is, you weren't the one who needed convincing. I've been pushing for this for years, and frankly, your sudden interest in my ideas feels a little too late. If it takes a letter from Aaron Johnson to make you listen, then it says more about the culture of this company than it does about the market." Brad's face flushed slightly, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Maria, I'm just trying to make things right." Maria shook her head, unimpressed. "You can't make things right with a half-hearted apology. You either understand the value of diversity and innovation, or you don't. And the fact that it took Aaron Johnson for you to realize that shows how much work we still have ahead of us." With that, she turned her attention back to her screen, dismissing Brad without another word. As he walked away, Maria felt a small sense of victory, though it was tinged with sadness. She had fought for this change on her own for so long, only to now be confronted with people who had always benefited from the status quo suddenly pretending they were allies. She wasn't interested in their late-stage conversion. She had bigger plans. Across the city, in his penthouse office overlooking the skyline, Aaron Johnson was reflecting on the events of the past few days. His decision to send the letter had clearly rattled the leadership at Bradford Industries. Jonathan Bradford was a proud man, and Aaron knew that his words had struck a nerve. The question was, what would Jonathan do next? Would he continue to dig in his heels, or would he recognize that change was not only inevitable but necessary for the company's survival? Aaron had been in the world of finance long enough to know that no company could remain static in a rapidly evolving market. He had seen businesses that refused to adapt get left behind, and others that embraced change soar to new heights. His investment in Bradford Industries had been based on a belief that Jonathan Bradford could be convinced to evolve, but that belief was starting to waver. It wasn't just about making money after all. It was about making a difference. Aaron had seen firsthand how businesses that valued diversity outperformed their peers. These companies attracted talent from all backgrounds, cultivated innovation, and built loyalty in their customer base. But Bradford Industries, with its deep-rooted traditions and insular culture, was on the brink of falling behind. Aaron knew that if Bradford Industries was to thrive, it needed to change. He had to find a way to force that change. He couldn't afford to wait for Jonathan Bradford to come around on his own. So, Aaron began to prepare for his next move, one that would shake the company's foundations and leave no room for excuses. Meanwhile, in the executive offices, Jonathan was growing increasingly agitated. The tension in the air had become suffocating. His usual confidence had begun to erode, replaced by frustration and doubt. His interactions with his senior team had become strained, with many of his executives voicing their concerns in hushed tones. Brad Thompson, in particular, had been adamant that they maintain the company's traditional values. But Jonathan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the world was moving forward, and Bradford Industries was standing still. In his office, Jonathan sat alone late one evening, staring at the city below. The skyline, once a symbol of his success, now seemed like a reminder of his isolation. He picked up the letter again, rereading Aaron's words. "You've built this company from the ground up, and you're going to keep doing it our way." Aaron's words echoed in his mind. But Jonathan knew, deep down, that he couldn't keep doing things the same way. He had built Bradford Industries on a vision of unwavering control and tradition, but that vision was becoming obsolete. The market was changing. The world was changing, and whether he liked it or not, Bradford Industries had to change with it. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of his most trusted advisor, Sarah, his assistant. "Sarah, I need you to set up a meeting with Aaron Johnson," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "It's time we had a real conversation." The next day, Aaron received the call. He had been expecting it, but it still sent a surge of anticipation through him. Jonathan Bradford was finally ready to talk. But this wasn't going to be just another meeting. Aaron knew that the stakes were higher now. He wasn't going to sit across from Jonathan and accept more excuses or empty promises. This was his opportunity to push Bradford Industries toward the change it so desperately needed. As Aaron prepared for the meeting, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. His career had always been about breaking down barriers, fighting for equality in spaces that traditionally excluded people like him. He had faced countless obstacles, but each one had only strengthened his resolve. He was used to being underestimated, to having his ideas dismissed. But each time, he had come back stronger. Now, with the eyes of Bradford Industries on him, Aaron was ready to make his move. He had the power to reshape the company, to challenge the outdated paradigms that held it back, and to create a more inclusive, innovative future. As the day of the meeting approached, Aaron felt the weight of history upon him. This wasn't just about one company or one man. It was about a future where diversity wasn't just a buzzword, but a core principle that drove progress, innovation, and success. And he was determined to lead the charge. The meeting that changed everything. The day of the meeting had arrived. Aaron Johnson was dressed in a sharp navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his posture upright. There was a sense of calm resolve about him as he sat in his sleek penthouse office, staring out at the skyline of the city below. He had built his career on moments like this, moments where everything hung in the balance, where the next decision would ripple through the business world like a stone cast into still water. But this meeting felt different. For one, it wasn't just about business. It was about something larger. Aaron was not just a businessman. He was a symbol of progress, of breaking down the barriers that had long kept many people from entering the corridors of corporate power. Today, he would confront Jonathan Bradford, the man who had built Bradford Industries into the powerful corporation it was, and challenge him to rethink his whole approach to business. Aaron knew this meeting wouldn't be easy. Jonathan Bradford was stubborn. He had always believed that Bradford Industries thrived on tradition, that the company's success came from staying true to a set of principles that had worked for decades. He had built his empire on the belief that stability, consistency, and control were the keys to success. But now, as Aaron's letter had so boldly pointed out, that world was changing, and if Jonathan didn't adapt, he risked losing everything. Aaron's phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. The meeting was set for 11:00 a.m. at Bradford Industries headquarters. It was an elegant, towering building in the heart of the city, a symbol of Jonathan Bradford's achievement and power. Aaron stood up, straightening his jacket, and took a deep breath. He had prepared for this moment for weeks. He was ready. When Aaron walked into the expansive, polished conference room of Bradford Industries, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Jonathan Bradford was already seated at the head of the table, his usual air of composure slightly frazzled. The walls, adorned with framed pictures of Bradford Industries' various achievements, were a reminder of the company's long legacy. Jonathan had worked his entire life to build this empire. And now, that empire was at a crossroads. Jonathan stood as Aaron entered, his handshake firm, but lacking the warmth it once might have had. "Aaron," he greeted curtly, "I trust you had no trouble getting here." "Not at all, Jonathan," Aaron replied, his voice even. He shook Jonathan's hand, feeling the coldness in the gesture. "Thank you for meeting with me." They both took their seats, Jonathan facing Aaron across the polished conference table. The room felt larger than usual, the silence pressing down like a heavy weight. "I've been thinking a lot about your letter," Jonathan began, leaning back in his chair, his tone measured. "And I've had to take a long, hard look at how Bradford Industries operates and what you're saying about the direction we need to go. I'm not going to pretend that it hasn't rattled me. But the truth is, I've built this company from the ground up, and I know what works." Aaron remained calm, his expression neutral. "Jonathan, I respect what you've done here. You've built a remarkable company, and there's no denying that Bradford Industries has been successful. But success, as you know, doesn't always last forever. And the world is changing." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "And you believe that change means we have to compromise our values." "Not compromise," Aaron said steadily, meeting Jonathan's gaze. "Evolve. Adapt. I've seen companies that resisted change, companies that held on to outdated beliefs about who should be in power and who should be included. And those companies, they're fading into the background. The market is shifting, Jonathan. People want to do business with companies that represent them, that reflect the world they live in. And in that world, diversity isn't just a buzzword, it's a necessity." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He had spent decades cultivating a culture that valued loyalty, tradition, and familiarity. Now, the very principles that had made Bradford Industries successful seemed like they were being called into question. He had always been the one to dictate the terms, the one who set the course for the company's future. But now Aaron was telling him that this approach was no longer sustainable. "What do you propose, then?" Jonathan asked, his voice tight with restrained frustration. Aaron leaned forward, his eyes steady. "I propose that you start listening. To your employees, to your customers, to the people who make this company what it is. I propose that you stop seeing diversity as a threat and start seeing it as an opportunity. Bradford Industries needs to be more than just a reflection of what it was. It needs to reflect where the world is going. And if you can't see that, then I'm afraid I'm going to have to reconsider my investment." Jonathan's face remained impassive, but internally, the words hit hard. The very thought of losing Aaron's financial support was something he had not prepared for. Aaron Johnson was more than just an investor. He represented the future, the kind of forward-thinking leadership that Jonathan had always resisted. But it was clear that this conversation was more than about money. It was about the survival of Bradford Industries. "You know," Jonathan said, his voice softer now, "you're asking me to do something that goes against everything I've built. I've spent my life making Bradford Industries what it is. I've made sacrifices, and I've fought to maintain control. And now you're telling me that I need to give up that control, to open the doors wider, to let in people who might not fit the mold." Aaron didn't flinch. "I'm asking you to see beyond the mold, Jonathan. The world doesn't fit into your old ideas anymore. There are brilliant minds out there, minds that don't look like yours, that don't come from the same background. And if you continue to exclude them, you're not just limiting your company's potential, you're losing out on the best talent, the best ideas. There was a pause as Jonathan absorbed Aaron's words. He glanced out of the window, his gaze distant. The skyline outside, a symbol of his success, suddenly felt like a reminder of what he had built alone. The people who worked under him, the executives, his employees, they all looked up to him, but how many of them had been excluded because they didn't fit the traditional mold? How many ideas had been discarded because they didn't conform to what Bradford Industries had always stood for? Jonathan's mind raced as he began to reconsider everything he had thought to be true. He had prided himself on building a company that stood for tradition, for consistency, for control. But now, the cracks in that foundation were becoming too obvious to ignore. He looked back at Aaron, his expression softer now, a flicker of vulnerability appearing in his eyes. "I'm not sure I can do it," Jonathan said quietly. "I've spent my whole life keeping this company on course, protecting it from change. What if I let go of that control and it all falls apart?" Aaron's voice was calm but firm. "Jonathan, the world is changing, whether you like it or not. But change doesn't mean losing control. It means gaining the ability to lead with vision, not fear. It means trusting your people, trusting new ideas, and creating an environment where everyone can contribute to the company's success." For the first time in the meeting, Jonathan seemed to be considering the possibility. His eyes softened as he met Aaron's gaze, and for a moment, there was a brief flicker of understanding. "Maybe I've been holding on to something that's no longer useful," Jonathan said slowly. "Maybe I've been too rigid. I've always believed that success came from keeping things in order, keeping things controlled. But I'm beginning to see that there's a bigger picture." Aaron nodded, his expression resolute. "That's all I'm asking for, Jonathan. A chance to build something new, a Bradford Industries that can thrive in the future. It's not about abandoning the past, it's about evolving into something greater." There was a silence that stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the conversation. Jonathan, who had been so sure of himself, now found himself on the brink of change. He had built Bradford Industries on a vision of stability and control, but now he was beginning to see the limitations of that vision. And as much as it scared him, he knew that Aaron was right. "All right," Jonathan said quietly, his voice carrying a new sense of determination. "Let's figure this out. Let's make Bradford Industries a company that leads the way, not just in profits, but in innovation and inclusivity." Aaron's face broke into a faint smile. It wasn't a victory yet. It was just the beginning. But for the first time in years, it felt like something had shifted. The old guard was beginning to crumble, and in its place, something new and powerful was emerging. Aaron had planted the seed of change, and now it was up to Jonathan and the rest of the company to nurture it. As the two men shook hands once more, the tension in the room began to lift. There was still much work to be done, but the foundation for a new Bradford Industries was being laid. And this time, it wouldn't be built on tradition alone. It would be built on the strength of diversity, innovation, and progress. The new dawn. The weeks that followed the meeting between Aaron Johnson and Jonathan Bradford marked the beginning of a slow, deliberate transformation at Bradford Industries. The company had always been built on the principles of tradition, loyalty, and control, but now the winds of change were pushing through its walls. Jonathan Bradford, once resolute in his belief that the company's past was its greatest strength, was now grappling with the idea that its future could be even more powerful. The initial conversations about diversity and inclusivity that had seemed like an inconvenient distraction just months ago were now front and center. Bradford Industries Board, which had long been resistant to change, found themselves slowly giving in to the pressure. Aaron Johnson's influence had become undeniable. The question wasn't whether the company would evolve. It was how fast it could adapt before falling further behind its competitors. Jonathan was more introspective than ever. At his desk in his spacious corner office, he pored over data that illustrated the changing demographic landscape, the shifting needs of consumers, and the undeniable fact that companies that embraced diversity were reaping the benefits in both innovation and profitability. He couldn't shake the feeling that the company he had spent his life building was now at a crossroads. The old ways that had once seemed untouchable, were crumbling beneath him. It was a Wednesday morning when Jonathan decided it was time to address the entire company. For months, he had avoided speaking on the issue of diversity, preferring to let others take the lead. But now, the weight of responsibility was squarely on his shoulders, and he knew that if he wanted to guide Bradford Industries into a new era, he had to lead by example. The conference room was packed, the mood tense with anticipation. Every department head, every senior executive, and a cross-section of employees from various levels were present. The air was thick with expectation as Jonathan Bradford stood at the front of the room, hands clasped together, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a rare intensity. "I've spent my life building this company," Jonathan began, his voice steady, but with an edge of emotion that surprised even him. "For decades, we've followed the same principles that I believe were the cornerstone of our success. We've been focused on what we know and what we can control. But today, I stand before you to tell you something I didn't want to admit before. The world is changing, and so must we." A murmur rippled through the room. The employees, who had grown accustomed to hearing Jonathan speak of the company's enduring strength and time-tested strategies, were now hearing something different. The silence that followed his words was thick with uncertainty. "I've realized that the strength of this company has not come solely from tradition and control," Jonathan continued, "but from the people who work here, from the ideas that come from every corner of this organization. We've missed out on something that could have taken us to the next level, and that something is diversity." The words hung in the air, as if Jonathan were laying bare a deep truth that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Many of the employees exchanged cautious glances. They knew the company had been resistant to change, and there was a part of them that wondered if Jonathan's speech was just a well-crafted attempt to placate the growing pressure from the outside world. But then Jonathan surprised them all. "We've been failing to truly see the potential of our team. We've been shutting out voices that could make us stronger, smarter, and more innovative. And I want to apologize for that. For too long, we've held on to outdated beliefs about what success looks like and who gets to define it." Maria Rodriguez, who had been sitting near the front of the room, felt a surge of emotion. She had heard the excuses, the dismissals of her ideas, the conversations behind closed doors about what kind of people fit into Bradford's culture. She had spent years fighting to make herself heard, to prove that her voice mattered. And now, here was Jonathan Bradford, acknowledging it all. The apology was far from perfect, but it was a start. "I want to tell you," Jonathan said, his voice stronger now, "that the leadership of Bradford Industries is committed to change. We are going to start embracing new ideas, new voices, and new perspectives. We will invest in our people, all of our people, regardless of their background, race, or gender. We will build a company that reflects the world we live in, one that doesn't just talk about diversity, but actively fosters it." There was a pause, a long beat where no one spoke. Jonathan's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implications. The room was filled with a sense of cautious hope, a glimmer that things might actually be different this time. "I know," Jonathan added, "that I can't do this alone. I need every single one of you to be part of this change. It's not enough for me to say the right things. I need you to help me, to help all of us make this company a place where everyone's voice is valued and where new ideas can thrive." As he finished his speech, the room remained silent for a moment. Then, slowly, a few employees began to clap. It was hesitant at first, but as more people joined in, the applause grew louder. It wasn't a standing ovation. This wasn't a victory yet, but it was a sign that Jonathan's words had landed. There was hope, however cautious, that Bradford Industries might actually be turning a corner. The weeks following Jonathan's speech were filled with small yet significant changes. A diversity task force was created, composed of employees from across departments and backgrounds, tasked with making tangible recommendations for the company's evolution. For the first time in Bradford Industries' history, discussions about inclusivity were no longer relegated to side conversations or HR training sessions. They were front and center. Aaron Johnson's influence remained strong, but he had become something more than just an investor. His leadership and his insistence on progress had forced Jonathan and his team to rethink their approach to leadership. Aaron was no longer a distant voice in the corporate boardroom. He was a partner in the journey. Maria Rodriguez, empowered by the changes, found herself stepping into a new role. She was appointed to lead a major rebranding initiative aimed at repositioning Bradford Industries as a company that championed diversity and innovation. The project was ambitious, and Maria knew it was her moment to prove that the company could not only talk the talk but walk the walk. She surrounded herself with a team that reflected the diversity she had long championed. People from different backgrounds, ethnicities, and walks of life. Their ideas, once marginalized, were now driving the vision for Bradford Industries' future. And the energy in the room was palpable. For the first time in years, Maria felt like she wasn't just fighting for her voice to be heard. She was helping to shape the future of the company. Meanwhile, Aaron continued to push for tangible changes in Bradford's executive ranks. It wasn't enough to simply diversify the lower ranks or the entry-level positions. Aaron and Maria pushed Jonathan and his leadership team to focus on diversifying the upper echelons of the company as well. It was slow, incremental work, but the ripple effects were starting to be felt. Jonathan Bradford, once the symbol of unyielding tradition, now found himself working alongside people he had once dismissed, learning from voices that had previously been silenced. He was no longer simply the king of his corporate castle. He was a leader working in tandem with a diverse group of individuals, all of whom brought their own unique perspectives to the table. And as Bradford Industries began to shift, so did the external world's perception of the company. The media started to take notice, reporting on the new direction that Bradford was taking. Competitors, once too proud to admit their own shortcomings, were beginning to follow suit. It was as if the whole industry was waking up to the fact that diversity wasn't just a trend, it was the future. In the months that followed, Bradford Industries saw tangible growth in areas that had once been considered unconventional. The company's marketing strategy, now more inclusive and reflective of the diverse consumer base it aimed to reach, resulted in a significant uptick in brand loyalty. Sales in previously underserved markets began to rise. And perhaps most significantly, Bradford Industries began to attract a new kind of talent, people who had long felt excluded from the company's traditional mold, but who now saw Bradford as a place where their ideas and experiences were valued. For Jonathan Bradford, the changes came slowly, but they were no longer in doubt. He had been forced to confront the limits of his previous vision for the company. And now, with the help of Aaron, Maria, and others, he was beginning to see a new horizon for Bradford Industries. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about building a company that was truly representative of the world outside. As Aaron looked out over the skyline from his office one evening, he thought about the long road that had brought him here. He had seen companies like Bradford Industries stand on the brink of collapse because they refused to change. But now, he was witnessing a company reborn, one that was ready to face the future, armed with the strength of diversity, inclusion, and innovation. The future of Bradford Industries was no longer uncertain. It was bright, and Aaron knew that this was just the beginning.